What's up, y'all? Des the Mess back once again. Today's episode is going back into the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, where we left off from last time. So if you're just jumping into this series, I recommend going back on the playlist, which should be on that side, and going through that episode. I was going to say reading. You would kind of be reading along with us, potentially, if that's what you want to do. But if you're just listening, either way, we stopped off in the middle of the chapter, The Doctor's Opinion. We're about 2 pages from the end. And for reference, if you don't remember, you're watching this 2 weeks after the original aired. Excuse me. If you're watching this 2 weeks after the last episode aired, we were talking about how they used the term psychopath in this book, as well as in that time period, the 20s and 30s. They used the term psychopath to mean kind of anybody with an emotional or mental illness. So, obviously in a modern context, much different. When we're talking about this, there's a lot of that old language, right? Which is something we talked about on the last episode. So, again, it's problematic. As a Satanist and a leftist, I do my best to appreciate where this is coming from while also being critical of it, because I am a critical thinker, right? I consider myself a bit of a free thinker. So, knowing all of that, I want to make sure I'm applying this in the best terms possible, taking what's good from it, discarding what's not. Anything that's problematic or outdated, we just can't use. Strictly put, we can't use that stuff. So we're going to jump back in. We are on page XXX. And we had just finished talking about the psychopaths who are emotionally unstable. There is the type of man who is unwilling to admit that he cannot take a drink. I have been there. Mostly with weed, but definitely with alcohol. For me, it was kind of easier to see as a late teen and early 20-something experimenting with alcohol that I had or would develop a problem because I was a binge drinker. So I knew, every time I drink, I get really drunk really quickly and do problematic things. So it was easier for me to justify that I might have a problem with alcohol, even if I wasn't calling myself an alcoholic, than it was to identify problems I was developing with cannabis use. So there's that, right? Like, for me, I have to adapt that to my drug of choice mostly. I was unwilling to admit that I cannot smoke weed. I thought, well, Michael Phelps smokes weed, Snoop Dogg smokes weed, people like that are successful and they smoke weed every day. Well, guess what? I am neither rich nor privileged enough to afford to be able to do that. Most of my life, I've worked at minimum wage jobs. So, smoking weed every day wasn't doing me any favors. It made me a shitty employee. It made me a shitty partner to people I dated. It made me a lazy, shitty person. Unwilling to actually dive into trauma and mental health issues I was experiencing and tackle them appropriately. And that's beside the fact that cannabis use has been shown to disrupt, in some cases, psych medication. So if you're on SSRIs, there's some stuff going on in your brain where they mess with the dopamine receptors, which makes it harder for your SSRIs to work correctly. There's also evidence to support the fact that cannabis use in your 20s and 30s can increase your risk of developing later in life conditions such as Alzheimer's and dementia. And if you're predisposed to psychosis, psychotic episodes, schizophrenia, and that sort of thing, it can kind of trigger them. So there's all of that. I don't experience a lot of those things. I have a feeling when I'm older I'll develop Alzheimer's and or dementia, because people in my family seem to do that, and it's partially genetic. So it's better if I don't smoke weed anymore. I was forgetful enough in my 20s when I smoked weed. I would be setting myself up for failure much more quickly if I continued to do so. So there is the type of man who is unwilling to admit that he cannot take a drink. He plans various ways of drinking, or smoking, or using your drug of choice. He changes his brand or his environment. There is the type who always believes that after being entirely free from alcohol for a period of time, he can take a drink without danger. That was me a lot, especially with drinking, right? I thought, well, I haven't drank in a year or two. I haven't drank in several months. What's the worst that could happen? Always. Always consequences. Every single time. I didn't understand it then. I understand it better now. I'm an alcoholic. I am a drug addict. I am in recovery now, so these things don't directly affect me today. But back then, it's like, no shit. No shit. You were developing a problem. There's no way you can plan to use successfully or recreationally once you've activated your addictive tendency. It's in very rare cases, I should say. I don't want to say things like never or always, because they're extremes and it paints black and white sort of thinking. In my experience, there's no way to plan to use drugs or alcohol successfully. It just doesn't happen. So knowing that, I have to do my damnedest to just not partake at all. Stay sober every single day for the rest of my life, if possible. That's what it is for me. There's the manic depressive type. Again, we're thinking in terms of 1920s and 30s when they're writing this book. There is the manic depressive type, who is, perhaps, the least understood by his friends, and about whom a whole chapter could be written. Weird omittance there, right? Again, this is the doctor's opinion, where they asked him to write his opinion as someone who worked in rehabs and clinics back in the day. And manic depressive back then was sort of different to what we now understand as bipolar mood disorder today. So it's different terminology. It has evolved over time. I wouldn't say bipolar people are the least understood today. I think there's some of... I want to be careful at how I say that, but I think they are more understood in a modern day context than they would have been in the 20s and 30s. So I can understand that. We now understand things like, serotonin and dopamine and how they affect people with bipolar disorder, and how there are two different types of bipolar disorder, and how we understand a lot better different things about manic depression and how it develops and how people can live more fulfilling lives and how we can help them balance their moods through medication, therapy, and other means. Back then, similarly to alcoholism, they didn't have that. Also, psychology is one of the newest sciences, right? Like, it's only been around a little over 100 years. So this stuff was not... It was being developed, okay? It's not like today where I can go on Google, you start with Wikipedia, and then you go on to better resources, right? Wikipedia is a good starting point, but please go on to better resources once you have a fundamental understanding of something. But the point is, I can Google bipolar disorder or manic depressive disorder, and I can find results, and then I can be linked to better resources. I can spend a couple hours on YouTube or something watching videos from professionals and people with their lived experiences who suffer from bipolar disorder to have a better understanding about it. Back then they didn't have that. You either knew someone with a book who could tell you, here's the information and this is how you can get to it, and their opinion on it. And that's kind of what they were doing with the doctor's opinion, because they didn't have a comprehensive book on how to recover from alcoholism. This was arguably, if it wasn't the first, it was the first major publication to really tackle it. There have always been self-help books. This is one that's largely been focused on group-based self-help, if that makes sense, right? Like, you don't go to you don't go to AA meetings by yourself. You go because you need community support and mutual aid, and then you meet with other people so you can build a support system to get the help you need to start working through the steps in this case. And that's the focus of this book. So they didn't have a lot of that stuff back then, and it's novel at this point in history. So in a modern context, anybody can write a self-help book. Anybody can come up with some sort of recovery program for mental health or alcoholism or addiction or whatever, right? If you're recovering from mismanaging your finances, you can find 1,000 different books about it, read all of them, and do kind of what I'm doing now. Take the good and discard the bullshit and figure out what works for you. That's the whole premise of what we're doing in this series. I'm going to get back in here because I've sidetracked a bit too much. So there is the manic-depressive type, he says, who is perhaps the least understood by his friends and about whom a whole chapter could be written. There should be a chapter about mental health specifically in this book, I think, because it's 2023 and most, if not all, people who suffer from alcoholism and addiction have underlying mental illness and or trauma and or other issues. But that might be a while away and a really rigid ask on my half. Then there are types entirely normal in every respect, except in the effect alcohol has upon them. They are often able, intelligent, friendly people. Some people really just have an alcohol or drug problem, and when they stop, they go back to being pretty decent people, you know? I don't understand that. I think science and psychology have come to a point now where we understand most people who engage in problematic drug use or alcohol use or other addictive issues, typically there's an underlying trauma, right? We're seeking comfort from substance or material things that other people don't because there's something lacking inside of us that feels the need to seek external validation, either from people, chemicals, you know, people have shopping habits, all sorts of stuff. So addiction typically is rooted in some sort of trauma. Typically is the key word. All these and many others have one symptom in common: they cannot start drinking without developing the phenomenon of craving. That's the theme. That is the theme of this chapter, and I think my alcoholism and addiction at large, which I talked about kind of at length in the last video, I cannot successfully use something without immediately wanting more of it, right? The first sip, the first hit, whatever, I'm like, man, I want more of this. I think the exceptions to that are acid and mushrooms, because on the time of use, I'm not immediately thinking like, man, I want more of this. But I'm not going to really split hairs, because I know if I were to actively engage in their use even as a recreational way, I would be making a justification for use later, right? Well, I did it just fine, and I had the weekend off, and I tripped, and I can do this again in a couple weeks or a couple months. I'm not doing that because it opens a door for me that I don't need to explore. I've walked down that hallway countless times and gotten here, where I'm dissecting the big book from a Satanist and leftist perspective. So, I don't think I need to be doing that anymore. This phenomenon, as we have suggested, may be the manifestation of an allergy which differentiates these people and sets them apart as a distinct entity. They're basically saying, right, the allergy, people will say, I'm allergic to alcohol, I break out in handcuffs. That's a joke based on this, where the doctor is suggesting that alcoholism is the manifestation of some sort of allergy that has the opposite effect on people who take alcohol and drugs as a normal allergy would. In that, if I'm allergic to poison ivy, I'm going to stay away. I'm not going to eat it. I'm not going to smoke it. I'm not going to bathe in it. I'm not going to walk through the woods if I know it's covered in poison ivy. I am allergic to poison ivy, and I get it really bad, so I stay away from it. But if I'm allergic to alcohol, like this doctor suggests, I want more of it, and I want a lot more of it, and that's why I can't do it. So I understand where they're going, but it is kind of an ironic, exaggeration of what an allergy is based on what we know allergies to be. But saying that alcoholics specifically are differentiated from other people, double-edged sword, right? Like, I, at this point in my recovery, and as a member of the working class, and yada yada, I don't see myself as different or separate from other people. I'm neither better nor worse than the next person in line. I'm just doing what I can with the information I've been given based on a chain of events that got me to where I'm at. So when I'm standing behind the guy being mean to the clerk at a convenience store, and the person behind me is like, man, that guy's just being a dick, I might agree, but I might not say anything. Not because I'm better than the guy in front of me or slightly worse than the guy behind me, but because it's just where I'm at, right? I am where I'm at. This is the hand that I've been dealt, and I now get to choose the cards I'm going to play. When I was in active addiction, I was fed a hand, and I let the drugs and alcohol decide what I was playing. And that never really worked out, because it got me to rehab and psych ward and sober house and whatever, I've made a lot of weird choices because at that point in my life, I was differentiated. I was alien. I was separate from other people. Now I don't feel that. I don't even feel like someone in active addiction or alcoholism or actively participating in their use is different or separate from me. I just see them as members of humanity doing the best they can with their situation based on the hand they were dealt. That's what it is. I'm not different than them. I'm just I'm standing on a different step. And that's okay. Like, in all other aspects, I look at that person as my equal. You are a human being. You deserve the same things everybody else deserves. Love, kindness, respect, a place to sleep at night, food on your table. All of the things I fight for politically, I think other people deserve, regardless of their choices or impulses. So I'm not differentiated from them. They're not differentiated from me. But again, the language in this is old. It has never been, by any treatment with which we are familiar, permanently eradicated. They're talking about the allergy, right? You can't, I don't want to say you. The idea is that a person suffering from alcoholism cannot simply just not be alcoholic anymore. I'm not going to say that that's true in every single case, because there are people who have really heavy problematic using issues in their early life, and then later on in life they're able to sit down and have a glass of wine with dinner occasionally, and that's not problematic for them. More power to them. I don't think I'll ever get to that place, and I don't want to try, because I have a history that lends me to believe that it would just be playing with fire. You can only put your hand on a stove so many times while it's warming up until you get burned. That's just what it is. So, the only relief we have to suggest is entire abstinence. I disagree, not for myself, because I require entire abstinence for me to be able to live a successful and fulfilling life on my terms. But to echo the point I was just making, there are people who engage in harm reduction, and some of them can engage in recreational use. I know people who've had really bad alcohol problems who engage in recreational cannabis use. I don't understand it because my problems were with alcohol and cannabis. So, it's, for me, I can't recreationally pick up meth or heroin or something, because I know, as bad as I was with alcohol and cannabis, I would just be developing a much more difficult problem to overcome by engaging in something else. That's what it is for me. So I'm not going to recommend every single person become abstinent. I would recommend, if you think that's the path for you, to try it out, right? In most cases, will only feel better by not engaging in your drug of choice after a while. But that is coupled with therapy. That's coupled with medication if that's something you need. You need some sort of support group. I do not recommend doing this kind of thing alone, going sober, especially if you're on a drug that's a drug or alcohol, because alcohol's withdrawal symptoms will kill you if you are engaged in enough problematic drinking. The withdrawal from alcohol will kill you, and other drugs will have either similar or the same effect, right? All of that is to say, don't detox on your own. Go to a doctor, get the help you need. There are places for that. There are detox clinics. They may or may not want you to go to rehab. Whatever. Figure out what works for you, but please don't do it alone. You ought to, I don't want to should on anybody, but you ought to get professional help if you are actively struggling with a problem. And if you know someone who is, we encourage, we do not force, we do not tell them that they should. We can set boundaries. I don't like to set ultimatums with people, but I've done it sometimes because I have to protect myself and my recovery. That's what that is for me. But be stern, right? Be assertive but not aggressive if your loved one is experiencing problems, okay? They need help, but it's up to them to actually seek it and do the work required to achieve whatever recovery means for them. I'm not going to tell anybody they've got to be abstinent or that abstinence is the only way. I very highly disagree, and I really don't care who disagrees with me on this, but I disagree with people in AA who tout that total abstinence is the only way to get recovery. We have science that backs up the fact that not everyone needs total abstinence. And also, as I've said, it's not my position to judge someone who, let's say, engaged in heavy alcohol use and abuse and misuse, if you want to call it that, and now smokes weed and doesn't have a problem. Or the reverse could be true. And I know that doesn't apply to every single kind of substance. But just like I know people who, stopped drinking and just occasionally smoke weed, I know people who did not smoke cigarettes during their active addiction and now they can't quit smoking cigarettes and they have to have coffee every day. So again, there are layers to this and there's a lot of nuance required. And there are people who I've partially agreed with who have said, how can you call yourself sober and abstinent at an AA meeting if you have to have coffee and you have to have cigarettes? And I was like, you got 'em. Because it's true, right? Those are forms of harm reduction. I wouldn't say that person isn't sober. I would just say they've switched their drug of choice or they've gone to harm reduction. For me, smoking cigarettes was a logical step for me to get over the hand-to-mouth feeling that I craved when I stopped smoking weed. It made sense to me. Every time I've tried to stop smoking weed, I picked up cigarettes. And it got harder and harder to get off cigarettes the more that I picked them up. But knowing that, I recognize it as a form of harm reduction, even though cigarettes are arguably worse for your health, but I'm not going to get into semantics here. The point is, I can go to a job and work a job pretty decently, knowing that I get a cigarette every time I have a break at work, right? I can't do that when I'm under the influence of cannabis because it actively stops me being able to do my job effectively. Right? I'm a bad coworker because I can't remember things, or I misplace things, or my depth perception is skewed and you want me to like operate a forklift. Not only is that technically illegal, I could hurt somebody or myself, right? But I could damage property at my job because I'm under the influence of a drug. That's probably not going to happen if I have a cup of coffee and smoke cigarettes. That's the truth. You know, you could argue though, and I would be in favor of this argument, that coffee and cigarettes and sugar, we're going to talk about sugar too, are mood and mind altering substances. If you are partaking in, you know, the overuse of sugar or coffee or cigarettes, your mood is affected. People who need to smoke cigarettes every couple of hours get moody if they don't have it, right? If you're someone who doesn't have your morning coffee, how many people have seen those shirts that like, don't talk to me until I've had my coffee? Why does that stuff exist? Because the normalization of caffeine addiction has been normalized in society. And that's what that is, right? Like, that's exactly what that is. It's some people simply require caffeine every single day, in the same way that some people require nicotine every couple of hours, in the same way that some people can't even have that coffee without sugar in it. And if you take the sugar away, they're moody because the caffeine isn't enough. So now we're talking about using two mood or mind altering substances together. And when you think about the fact that lots of people, and when I say lots of people, I'm talking about people at large, but because we're talking about recovery, and I've seen it in rehab setting, will have their cup of coffee with sugar and milk in it, and they go outside and smoke a cigarette while they're drinking their coffee. And all I can think is, you stopped one drug, alcohol or heroin or whatever, and now you're doing three. And isn't that ironic? But it's harm reduction because they can get their job done. They can go to work and they can be a productive member of society and do whatever they need to do. Even if it makes them a little moody to not have those things, they can still get it done. I can't do that. I can't operate a forklift or move boxes around correctly or stock a shelf, you know, the correct way when I'm stoned or when I'm drunk. It's just not going to happen. I'm going to mess up. I'm going to break or lose things. That's been my experience forever. Again, that to me isn't truly entire abstinence. I don't smoke cigarettes today. I don't put sugar in my coffee, and I try to limit the amount of sugar that I intake because I understand why that's problematic. I usually have coffee before work. Why? Because it helps me get going. Does that mean I'm addicted? Maybe, but you know what? I'm engaging in harm reduction, so even I would say I'm not totally abstinent. But social normalization of certain drugs over others is a large discussion we could get into, and it's why I don't believe anybody is truly totally abstinent if they engage in these little things. But can you do your job? Are you showing up for your friends and family? Do you keep your important relationships and appointments? If all of those things are true, I wouldn't say you've got a problem specifically with cigarettes, caffeine, sugar, right? I mean, nobody should really be smoking cigarettes, but I'll never judge anybody for that. So that's what it is. The only relief they have to suggest, in the doctor's opinion, in Alcoholics Anonymous, is total abstinence. That works for lots of people. It does not work for everybody. And we will continue to argue that throughout this entire book every time it's brought up. This immediately precipitates us into a seething cauldron of debate. Much has been written pro and con, but among physicians, the general opinion seems to be that most chronic alcoholics are doomed. Now, that I would say is kind of true. If you've developed alcoholism to the point that you are experiencing, chronic health conditions, it's literally do or die. You either get off of the alcohol and start working on recovery, or you end up dead. Your liver shuts down. You get diabetes because there's usually a lot of sugar and all of the carbs, of course, that are in alcohol. There's a lot of problems with it. So yes, a chronic alcoholic, someone who physically cannot stop no matter what happens, I don't want to say they're doomed in a way that's they're not worth it, so much as I'm saying that's the reality of the situation. Many people who struggle with alcoholism to such an extent will face it their entire lives until the bitter end. And that really sucks, because I want everyone to be afforded a chance to recover. And I know for some people it will not ever happen. Right? I wrote that. I really should use that big book sometimes. In my study copy, if you will, of the big book, on the opening flap, I wrote, "People will die." Why? Because it's true. It's true and it's sad, but that's reality. People will die. People who I think got their recovery down packed could die, and I have to understand that. Also knowing people who never get to see recovery will die, and I'm going to meet people who struggle with that, and I'm going to love, and I'm going to be friends with, and I'm going to have lots of different kinds of relationships with people who struggle with chronic alcoholism throughout the course of my life and theirs. And at some point I have to recognize that they may not want help, or they may think their situation is hopeless, and I love them and I accept them as they are anyway, because I know they will die and I can't tell them what they have to do. They gotta figure it out on their own. I can be a resource. If someone ever asks me, what can I do? Or do I have meetings or resources? Yeah, absolutely, but it's not my job to tell someone else. It's not my responsibility. I can't force anyone to do anything else, no matter how much I want to. I have accepted that, and it sucks. It really hurts sometimes, knowing that my friends are struggling, knowing people I care about. I have family members who could probably be doing better for themselves, and it's not my job to tell them. They have to figure it out. What is the solution? We'll find out. Perhaps I can best answer this by relating one of my experiences. Again, this is still the Dr. Silkworth talking. About 1 year prior to this experience, a man was brought in to be treated for chronic alcoholism. He had but partially recovered from a gastric hemorrhage and seemed to be a case of pathological mental deterioration. He had lost everything worthwhile in life and was only living, one might say, to drink. He frankly admitted and believed that for him there was no hope. I was just talking about this. Following the elimination of alcohol, there was found to be no permanent brain injury. He accepted the plan outlined in this book. 1 year later, he called to see me, and I experienced a very strange sensation. I knew the man by name and partly recognized his features, but they were all... He accepted the plan outlined in this book. 1 year later, he called to see me, and I experienced a very strange sensation. I knew the man by name and partly recognized his features, but there all resemblance ended. From a trembling, despairing, nervous wreck had emerged a man brimming over with self-reliance and contentment. I talked with him for some time, but was not able to bring myself to feel that I had known him before. To me, he was a stranger, and so he left me. A long time has passed with no return to alcohol. When I need a mental uplift, I often think of another case brought in by a physician prominent in New York. The patient has made his own diagnosis and, deciding his situation hopeless, had hidden in a deserted barn, determined to die. He was rescued by a searching party and, in desperate condition, brought to me. Following his physical rehabilitation, he had a talk with me in which he frankly stated he thought the treatment a waste of effort, unless I could assure him, which no one ever had, that in the future he would have the willpower to resist the impulse to drink. His alcoholic problem was so complex and his depression so great that we felt his only hope would be through what we then called moral psychology, and we doubted if even that would have any effect. However, he did become sold on the ideas contained in this book. He has not had a drink for a great many years. I see him now and then, and he is as fine a specimen of manhood as one could wish to meet. I earnestly advise every alcoholic to read this book through, and though perhaps he came to scoff, he may remain to pray. William D. Silkworth, M.D. So again, right, we're looking at 1920s, 1930s. Alcoholic treatment was largely, I don't want to say new, right? There's a lot of cases throughout history of people who experienced alcoholism and tried various kinds of treatment. But this concept was new. Alcoholics Anonymous, meeting with a group, doing essentially, basic therapy with a support system, working a program. There were groups who did that sort of stuff, but this is what grew popular. The reason why it grew popular is because of its spiritual rather than religious approach. Knowing that, I struggle with this, okay? I struggle with it because I'm an atheist. Because I don't believe in God, I would like for more programs that are secular or based in non-theistic principles to come, right? I want them to exist, and I want them to flourish, and I want people to find them without the spiritual and theistic language attached, frankly. But I also understand that in the entire world, more people believe in the concept of God than do not. So when people talk about, well, AA doesn't work for me, I understand. But I also know, unfortunately, that is a minority opinion, okay? Like, there are atheists who work this program, and they simply avoid the God language. I can't say I don't know how they do it, because I have done it. I don't know how everyone else does it, because my approach is tailored to Satanism. And the word God does not specifically offend me or traumatize me in the way that it does other people. I can understand all of that, and also understand why someone working this program who believes in the concept of God, whether that is a religious idea or just a general spiritual idea, or their placeholder term for that thing I don't understand about the universe and the laws of science that have yet to be discovered, which is a lot of times what I use the word God for. When I'm talking to people about God as a concept, I think about it as that it's the unquestioned, unanswerable thing, right? We haven't figured out the question to ask about the why for that, so then it has to be God. In the same way that people in the past were like, it rains. Why does it rain? Because of a rain god. Now we know there's a lot of weather effects. I'm not a weather scientist, so I'm not going to talk in those terms. But you get the point, right? We understand that water is precipitated out of the ground by the sun into the clouds, or forms clouds, I should say. And when the clouds get heavy enough, they return back to Earth to water it. It's just constantly recycling, upcycling, downcycling, I guess. It's the circle of life, as it were, is water going up and water coming down, and it re-nourishes the plants, and then it gets reabsorbed, whatever isn't used, and it gets filtered out, and then it comes back down, and it gets filtered out again, and then it goes back up. We understand that today as an aspect of science. Just about everyone on the planet agrees with that. Some people might still be like, wow, that's magical. God did that, right? God is the reason for science. I understand how people get to that conclusion, and I don't judge them for it, even if I think they're wrong for thinking that. But we don't know why the laws of physics exist. We just have proven that some of them work. And that's based on Earth, too, right? We have a lot of times, I think in most cases, because we live on Earth, and this is the best, when we do science, we're observing science as it is on Earth and our experience of the universe. So we have an Earth-centric view of science. If there are other intelligent civilizations in the universe, and I'm pretty sure there are, whether or not they're contacting us is a whole nother story. I have a video about aliens and acid. I will link up here so that if you want, my opinion on aliens. Anyway, they have a them-centered view of science. And maybe in the future, when our civilizations meet, if we survive that long, because look what we're doing. Anyway, if that happens, we can compare, right? Because they say math is a universal language, but it isn't. Okay, we use Arabic and Roman numerals in our math system. And you know who probably wouldn't do that? An extraterrestrial civilization. I know I'm getting sidetracked with all of this science talk, but stay with me here. If we are looking strictly at our understanding of the world, we have an Earth-centric understanding of science, okay? And there are people who live on this planet who still will say science has strict laws because God programmed them. There are atheists who believe that the world is a simulation, or a computer program, or kind of we're living in a matrix or a video game. And I would go back and say, if you believe that this is a program, then somebody programmed it. And therefore, you're trying to use fancy language to get out of saying you believe in God. You just don't want to call it God because you have a presumption that God comes from Christianity or whatever, you don't want the supernatural attached to it, so you dress it up in fancy words like simulation theory or string theory or quantum mechanics. And you're going to say all this fancy stuff to be like, well, I don't believe in God. I just believe that we're in a matrix. And I'm like, okay, who programmed it then? Smarty pants? Guess what? You don't know? Well, a Christian would probably tell you that if you think you live in a simulation, God programmed it. They're going to use that language. I'm going to call, if you're saying we live in a simulation, and maybe we do, I'm going to call that the master programmer. The master programmer would have put laws of physics and math into this simulation that we are able to trace but still don't fully understand. We know how they work, we don't know why they work, right? We understand how gravity works on Earth and how it's distorted in space. We understand how time works to an extent, but those are all human-made concepts of laws of the universe that we don't fully understand because we simply can't, because they were here before us and they will be here afterwards. We just figured out a way to measure them. And if you believe that, and if you believe that is the cause of us being in a simulation or being in a matrix, or because God did it, you agree. You agree with theists if you're an atheist who believes in that. So, right? I'm going to use all of that I just talked about to justify the fact that this program works for people who believe in God. And it also works for people like me who can say, I don't believe in God in a religious sense, and I'm an atheist because of that. But I understand that there are things about the universe I will never know, and I won't even think to ask. And whatever that is the placeholder that I put the word God for. And that makes it easier for me to talk to people who actively believe in God. Why? Because to them, God is the why. It's like, why do people exist? Because God put us here. Some of them believe the planet's only like 6,000 years old, and they're wrong. They're allowed to be wrong, but they believe that. Other people will be like, yeah, I believe in evolution. It's evidence of God. Yeah, I believe in this. I believe, whatever. I believe that rain falls the way that it does. I believe in gravity. I believe in electricity, which is another thing they talk about in this book, weirdly enough. And they say that they don't understand it. But the point is, a theist can still look at all of that stuff and be like, yeah, I understand science and I appreciate it. They are probably more progressive, some of them even leftists. They probably believe in things like queer rights, and they would look at it and be like, those are aspects of God, and that is aspects of God and humanity. And you know what? I don't agree, right? I don't agree, and I don't have to agree, but I can communicate with that person because we have a common language. When they say God, I understand that to them it's this current running through all things that we don't understand. I can't tell you how I have consciousness. Psychology can't even fully comprehend that. We know that it's chemical reactions, but we still haven't figured out. There's so much about our brains we haven't figured out. So when I say this program works for people who believe in God, that's true. It mostly works for people who believe in God. It also works for people like me who have a very critical take on it. And I can look at the problems in it and I can say, well, that's outdated language, or they shouldn't talk about women that way, or that's an ethnic slur. Why is that even in the book? And that'll come up later. That'll come up later in the series. I can take all of that stuff and find good in it and discard the rest. In the same way, I can have a conversation with someone who believes in God and take good things out of it. I had to do that a lot. I've had to do that so many times. I'm not going into an AA meeting and expecting someone else to change their language for me so I can understand them. Okay, I keep in touch with my old sponsors, and they still say things like, to me this is my higher power working in my life. I don't disagree with them. I don't agree that that's what's happening, but I don't disagree with their perspective on it. Why? Because that's their experience. And if they believe that God is putting people and things in their path to make them better people, I'm glad they're a better person, and I'm not going to fight them. So, that last line, right? Though perhaps he came to scoff, he may remain to pray. I'm not going to pray. I'm also not going to scoff. I understand how this book works, and I understand how to make it work for me. I want to connect with people who are struggling with this as atheists and agnostics and Satanists and whatever, and see where I'm coming from, so that maybe if AA is something that you like but just have trouble figuring out, that's what this series is aiming to do. It's also, in a lighter way, trying to bridge the gap for people who actively believe in God. Because I don't have to believe in the same things as anybody else. When I go into an AA meeting, we're all there for the same thing: community and support, okay? Like, I get to stay sober another day for at least an hour that I'm in an AA meeting. I would say 2 hours, okay? Because typically there's a half hour or 15 minutes before where you're mingling and meeting people. You don't show up right at 8 o'clock and then leave right at 9 if that's when the meeting, slot is. Most people show up early because you're helping set up chairs or move tables around. You're brewing coffee. You're talking to people outside. If you're a smoker, right, you're going to hang out outside with the other smokers. Hey, I haven't seen you. Where are you from? What brings you to this meeting? How much sober time do you have? Is this your first day? Do you have a sponsor? Do you have a support group? Are you going to therapy? All of those things come up. That it's about building rapport with people. So when I go to a meeting, and I don't really do AA meetings anymore, but when I go to a meeting, I expect that I'm going to be sober for at least an hour and a half or 2 hours, because I'm talking to people and I'm gaining rapport and I'm connecting and I'm building new support, right? I'm meeting people where they're at, and I'm learning to support other people. And more often than not, like 99% of the time, I'm not going to find a Satanist. It's hard enough for me to find an atheist in AA, but I'm not going to argue with people who are like, yeah, like, I just feel like God's working for me. That's great. I'm glad that person's sober and is a productive member of their community, that they're showing up at an AA meeting with their 10, 20 years of sobriety and giving it back to other people. Even if I don't believe in the same concept of higher power as they do, we connect over the idea of the higher power. That's, for me, it's like, yeah, I can understand how your higher power works in your life the way mine works. And again, my idea of higher power is community and connection, and applying my religion as an atheist, as a Satanist in my life. I can understand where I can connect, right? Someone who typically in an AA meeting, someone who believes in God will believe in things like compassion and empathy and justice and accountability and kind of directing your own path. They just believe in doing that along what their idea of God is, right? Well, if God has that in your plans, I'm glad you and I are sitting here having that conversation. I'm never going to judge somebody for that. I'm never going to scoff at someone for being like, I went to an AA meeting. I'm fucking happy you're getting help. I don't have to agree with everything in this book. I've never agreed with every single thing any sponsor that I've had has said. And the ones that I've had specifically have appreciated the fact that I look at these things with a critical eye, because it means I'm willing to grow. They looked at that as evidence of my growth. I can question it, and sometimes I disagreed, and I still found a way to compromise and work this program to help me get sober in the beginning, because I didn't have options that really worked for me outside of it. I would later come to discover other better things. I don't want to say better, but other things that worked for me, that were better for me. Okay? But I have a lot of good experiences, and I have a lot to base my sobriety on, and I have a lot to thank AA for helping me get there. So yeah, like, this book is problematic as hell, and we're going to continue exploring it. But all of that is to say, when they are saying, that they want everybody to read this book, and they think that through this program people will get sober and find God, yeah, like, most people believe in God in some way, and they will find their way back to whatever concept of God they already had in mind. Some of them end up becoming Christians and going to church. Some of them have more generic pagan or pseudo-spiritual views where they're just like, I don't know what the hell God is. I just call it God because that's what everyone else calls it. Me too, buddy. Right? As an atheist, as a Satanist, I would call it that too. Why? Because I don't have another word to describe that experience. It's just, to you it's God, and to me it has to be God. It doesn't have to be God, but that's what it is. We're talking about the evolution of language and why that's important in this context, in a recovery context. I can't connect to other people by convincing them they have to use the same language as me, right? If I go to another country and they don't speak English, I have to know their language. In this case, I know the language of people who talk about God. I know the language of AA, so I can communicate with them. I'm not going to agree on every single thing they say, and maybe somewhere in the translation we might misunderstand each other and still get the point across of what we're trying to say to each other. But it's there. So, all of that wraps up, I think, pretty nicely. I was going to get into Bill's story, but I think we can save that because we had a lot to talk about in just these 2 pages. But this book has a lot of good things in it, and more importantly, it has things in it that cause discussion. What I'm doing here, where I'm just having a monologue at whoever's listening about my thoughts on this, is what I would do in my last AA home group. We had a big book meeting, okay? Like, we're expected to talk maybe 5 minutes about whatever it was, right? We all read. We spend the first, half hour or so reading, and then we all talk about it. Hey, I attached to this thing on page whatever. Or when they said this, it made me think of that. Or in my experience, I had a different experience. All of that can be true, right? Like, that's the point. For me, going to an AA meeting, specifically a big book meeting where we're reading the material, that's what I'm doing, is I'm using my language to talk in someone else's language. I'm saying, I know what they're talking about here, and this is my interpretation. How do I say that to the room? I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to discriminate. I don't want to push anybody else away. I'm just going to talk in language that is apparent to me and get my experiences across. And sometimes, a lot of times, that meant using words like higher power. I won't say God in a meeting unless I'm talking to someone specifically about their interpretation of God. I'm not going to be like, well, God did this in my life, because I know that's not true to me. It's true to somebody else, so I'm not going to discriminate in that way. But for the sake of speaking the AA language, yeah, I'm going to be like, yeah, I see my higher power working in my life. Why? Because it's language all of them will understand. They might not realize my subtext is, I see compassion, empathy, and fighting for justice. I see the group at large and reaching out to my support system working in my life. They're not getting all of that. They're getting their interpretation, but a lot of it is the same. We're just talking about it in different ways. So for me, it's not mental gymnastics, and I know some people would say that it is, but it's not. It's an exercise. It's translation. When I go... Like I said, when I go to another country and I start speaking their language to, like, ask for directions or buy food, I'm not doing mental gymnastics. I'm just speaking their language to the best of my ability, knowing all that I know in English, and then trying to say it in their language. I'll say Japanese because that's what I'm learning. I have to do that. I have to take my interpretation of their language to the best of my ability and try to get the point across. And how do I do that? It's not mental gymnastics, it's translation, right? English go in, Japanese come out, essentially. Like, I do the same thing when I'm in an AA meeting or when I'm talking about these terms. When someone else says, my God is working in my life, I translate it partially to my higher power is working in my life. And then I translate it fully to treating people with respect and compassion and fighting for the things that I know are correct and on the right path and whatever, right? Like, declaring my bodily inviolability by not putting drugs and alcohol into me is working in my life. I've translated it twice to get to the point I need to make, so I'm never going to tell someone, well, that's not true. Right? I have a harder time sometimes talking to other atheists than I do talking to someone who believes in God. Why? Because a lot of times, and it's not true of everybody, so I'm not going to stereotype, but in my experiences, atheists can be insufferable about the beliefs of others. And it's really ironic to me because they're acting in such a way as they say a theist would do. And again, there are theocrats, right? There are theocrats in this country and in others who would say that, like, their God is the only God and you have to do that or else. And when they say or else, they mean it, right? They want to enact laws, and usually some of them punishable by death. They want to enact those laws on a whole country, right? It happens with extremists in this country. It happens in lots of other places. I'm gonna be careful because it's a contentious thing. The point is, there's a difference between a theocrat and someone who's at an AA meeting who's just like, yeah, like, I see God working in my life. Good, I'm glad, because that person's sober another day and they get to help someone else who thinks like them. In the same way, when I show up at the meeting, I'm looking for people who think like me, and we don't have to agree on every single term, but I'm gonna find the things we have in common and move forward with it. I'm not gonna waste my time on the guy who's obviously a Donald Trump supporter in an AA meeting. I'm glad that guy's sober, and I hope that through his recovery, he learns maybe why that's not the way to go about it, but it's not for me to say. I'm simply not going to get that guy's number or invite him into my support group, because I'm going to find people who have similar politics as I do, even if they happen to believe in God. That's a whole nother discussion that I could go on for hours about, as you can probably assume. But when it comes to the AA program, I'm really trying to connect with people who have similar goals for their recovery. And that includes, but is not limited to, not discriminating against people who use the language of talking about God, okay? Like, I really don't care. It's not for me, but I get it. I also understand, especially at the time this book was written, lots of people believe in God. More so, atheists are becoming a larger group in, I'll talk about US specifically, but they are. Around the world, generally. In some countries, it's illegal to not, it's... In places in the Middle East, like, if you are an atheist, you can be sentenced to death. That's true, right? And, like, I'm trying to be careful about saying that, because I understand there are things about their culture that I don't understand. So, the point is, while I live in the US and it's not illegal to be an atheist, I can still be discriminated against, and I understand that. But also, I'm not making it harder on myself intentionally, and I'm not demanding that other people stop believing in God, because I want to connect with them on the things we have in common. And there's a difference between someone who thinks God loves me because I'm trans and made me this way, versus someone who says God hates me because I'm trans and it should be illegal for me to exist. There's a pretty significant difference in that. And I can sort of suss that out when I'm in an AA meeting about who is going, like, I can talk to both of those people and both of them think, like, yeah, God, right? And they're using the same word for totally different concepts. And that's very important. And we're going to talk a lot more about that as this series develops. So we're going to cut it off there. We'll get into Bill's story next time. I think I said earlier I am not super fond of Bill's story, so some of it will be relating my experiences. It's harder for me to dissect some of it because it's his experience. I'll state plainly where I disagree with something that he says, although I can't think of anything off the top of my head right now that's specifically problematic. But, again, that kind of goes back to the conversation the monologue I just went on, about connecting to people regardless of where they come from and what language they're using, because that's super important. So if you like content like this, please come back in 2 weeks and watch the next episode when it's out. Like, follow, subscribe, find me on Threads and Instagram. I have a public Instagram page. I talk shit on Threads. I think it's funny. Donate below. I like doing this work. It is technically free, but it is not free to me because it takes my time and energy. I'm now trying to record on Fridays so that my videos are out Saturdays. That just works for me. So yeah, do all of the things, click all of the buttons, stay tuned. I'm putting episodes out in this series every 2 weeks, and the weeks between, I'm talking about Insane Clown Posse. I've got one of their shirts on today. And we're deep diving into their music and how I can relate to that stuff. So similar concepts, different language, different belief systems, and I can still, as I do with the AA book, find good things in their music as I do in this program. So it's all connected, it's all related, very intertwined. very satanic to take the good and discard the rest. Very leftist of me to take the approach that I'm doing. I don't want to pat myself on the back. The way I said that kind of sounded arrogant, but I think you get the point that I'm trying to get across here. Is I'm using my experiences to talk about these things and relate to other people. And if that's something you like, stay tuned, because it just keeps coming on and on. So that's all I got. I'm glad that you are here and watching and or listening to my vodcast. That's what I'm calling it. Glad for the support that I've gotten so far. Been doing this over 2 months now. I'm excited that I've been able to put out a video damn near every week. I think the only exception so far was like the first time it happened like 10 days apart or something. But it's happening. It's happening typically every Saturday at 9 a.m. Pacific. So if you are in the U.S. Pacific time zone, that's LA, San Francisco time zone, for those of us in the U.S., because I'm Amerocentric, unfortunately, that's when it shows up, 9 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday. Any other time zone, good luck. I'm not doing the math for you. I'm sorry. But yeah, so if you like what I'm doing, as I said, click all those buttons, send me a couple bucks. Let me know what you thought. Comment below. Send me a message. We can talk about it. If you want to talk directly to me or with me about this stuff, message me. We can set something up. I'm trying to do interviews and stuff. I would love to hear about other people's experiences in AA, especially if they're in a similar vein as I am, a leftist, a Satanist, a juggalo, whatever. I want to talk about it. I really do. So hit me up. Let's get the ball rolling. There's lots to talk about. There will continue to be more to talk about, and we're going to keep pushing through this book. And once we're done with this, we'll figure out a new direction, because there's lots of AA literature, so I'm sure we can find something. Thinking the 12 and 12 next, but that's a while away. We have quite a lot of ground to cover. If this is boring to you, I'm sorry, it's not for you. That's what it is. If you disagree with the stuff that I have to say, again, it's not for you. That is what it is. I'm glad for people who enjoy this sort of content. I'm going to keep putting it out for you and for me, because I enjoy it specifically. So, as I said, I'm glad you're here walking this journey with me. Be who you are, love who you are, find people who love and support you. If you can't, I do. Just know that. I want you to be the best version of yourself possible today, so that you can prepare for the better version of yourself tomorrow, because yesterday is already gone. So do what you can with the hand that you're dealt. Find me here 2 weeks from now talking about the same thing. Otherwise, I'm updating weekly in general. So check out my other series. I'm doing 2, like I said. One, they're rotating. So one next week, this one in 2 weeks. Glad you're here, and have a good rest of your day, evening, whatever. Time isn't real. Fuck that.